Well, let's make a start. So, hello everyone. Good to have you all here. And apologies for the sort of last minute change. As most of you know, we were hoping to do this as an in-person event and start you all off in our exhibition in the Lamb Gallery, our pattern play exhibition. But Storm Babette has had other plans, but it's in itself an interesting example of a type of pattern, weather pattern. So anyway, great to have you here online. I know there's obviously some people here online who weren't going to be able to actually join us in person, and we're also going to be recording this as well. So those people that obviously aren't able to join us, we can share the recording later. We just thought it'd be a really good idea. Our exhibition basically explores patterns in lots of different areas based on our own collections, so art, design, science, nature, and we just thought it'd be really nice to hear from different people across the university who are all in some way exploring patterns. So we should have a really interesting mix of different people. So we'll have four short talks, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So we'll get started with our first talk. So delighted to introduce Dr. Anne Keitel, who's a reader in cognitive neuroscience in psychology at the School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Law. And Anne's going to be telling us about rhythms. So Anne, we'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. Perfect. So I would like to introduce you to the world of rhythms. And what I mean by rhythms is basically rhythms as temporal patterns. So things that change over time, and they do this kind of rhythmically, or they fluctuate over time. And the first, and I would like to do this in a way that you maybe might not have thought about before. So the first rhythm I would like to introduce you to is the motor rhythm. And motor rhythm basically means that many things we do are rhythmic. And one thing that makes this very obvious is, for example, walking. So walking is not completely random, but we do this kind of in a consistent pattern with a consistent tempo as well. So this is rhythmic. This is a motor rhythm. But it's not just walking, it's actually many other things as well. For example, swimming, cycling, clapping, tapping your finger, or talking. All these things are rhythmic. They're not just completely random, but they're rhythmic. And moreover, it has been shown that people who walk fast, for example, they also tend to talk fast. And they also tend to clap fast, when they clap spontaneously, and all these other things together. So it has been shown that people have preferred motor rhythms. We all have this, and we either tend to do things fast, or we tend to do things slow, or everything in between. And the next rhythm I would like to introduce to you is perceptual rhythms. So in perception, just as with our rhythmic motor behaviors, we all tend to prefer to hear or see different rhythms or things presented at a different tempo. One very good example is music. So although probably all of us, we have slow songs that we like, we have fast songs that we like, or in the middle. When you ask people what kind of music do you prefer, fast or slow, then we are able to give an answer. I like maybe slightly faster music, other people like slower music, and so on. So music is a good example. But this idea of perceptual rhythms is not just about our preferences, it's also about when we are better able to make sense of what we hear or see, if it's the right tempo for us. So, for example, what that means is sometimes people around us speak very fast, and for some of us, this might present a perceptual challenge. So sometimes people talk so fast that some of us have actually problems following what they're saying. And the reverse can be true as well. So sometimes people talk so slowly that is really hard for us to follow because it's just so slow. And another example is processing visual information. So if you imagine that you're watching a movie, and sometimes these days, the scenes are cut together really, really fast in fast succession. And then for some of us, it might be harder to understand or to follow what's going on screen. So this is an example of where too fast visually presented information makes it hard for some of us to follow. So we've got this idea of things that we prefer and things that make us follow the world around us better. And the last little piece of the puzzle I would like to show to you is the idea of brain rhythms. So our brain activity is not completely random, it is also rhythmic. And some of you might have heard about brain waves, which is basically the same thing. So brain waves, you can also say brain rhythms, that's the same thing. And we know that we have fast and slow brain waves in our brain. And what this means is basically that our brain cells, our neurons, they don't just fire randomly, they like to fire rhythmically, and lots of them like to fire rhythmically together, and this is what we can measure as brain waves. And we have fast and slow ones, and we have shown that each brain area has a characteristic pattern of these brain rhythms. So some brain areas have just work very slowly, they have slow brain rhythms, some have fast ones, some have slow and fast ones, some have different fast ones, so really everything you can imagine, every combination is there, and this is very characteristic, so all of us show a similar pattern, but on top of that, we also have differences between people. So even for the same brain rhythm, so some of you might have heard about the alpha brainwave. That's I think the most famous brainwave that you can read about, that you might hear about. So if you imagine a brain area where we have this alpha brainwave, for example, at the back of our brain, this is very prominent. Even though we all have the same alpha brainwave, for some people it's a bit faster than for others. So we have these differences in brainwaves. So slightly slower or faster alpha brainwaves, or for other brainwaves as well. And now, to connect these things, you might now think about whether maybe motor rhythms and perceptual rhythms are connected. So maybe it's the case that people with a fast motor rhythm, the motor rhythm also influences how we perceive things. And this is something that we looked into with quite a few studies. So for example, with music, we showed that people who tap their finger fast also prefer faster music. So what we did here is we just asked participants to tap their finger on the keyboard, at the enter key of the keyboard, and we did several studies, some of them online, some of them in person. But if you ask people to just tap their finger at a pace that is comfortable for them, people do that, and we get a huge range of people either tapping really fast or really slowly. And then we did different things. We either just asked them what kind of music you prefer, fast or slow, or we played different music to them, different rhythms at different tempi, and asked them to rate how much they liked it. But the result is always the same. So people who have a fast motor rhythm also tend to prefer faster music. And then another example is speech. Here we also did several studies and found that people who speak fast themselves can also understand other people better who speak fast. And what we did here is we first assessed how fast people speak. So either they read out something for us, or they just talked freely, and then we recorded them, and then we could assess the speech rate. And then for the understanding part, we played participants' sentences that were either at a normal pace or that were sped up, so they were really hard to understand, 2-3 times the rate of normal speech, and they had to tell us how much they understood. And here we found, and we showed this in 3 different studies now, that yes, people who speak fast themselves, naturally, they also can understand fast-speaking people better. So the first one is an example of preferences, how our motor rhythm influences our preferences, and the second one is an example how our motor rhythm actually influences our comprehension skills. And the last connection I would like to make here is that you can imagine that the brain plays a big role in all of this, because, of course, all of our actions are initiated in the brain, and the brain is also very heavily involved in our perception. So it's likely that our brain rhythms influence these motor and perceptual patterns. And the first example is, again, music, which is something that we did. So we we recorded people's brain waves, and we found that people with faster brain waves in auditory brain areas, so those areas that process our auditory information, if they have a faster brain rhythm there, they also like to listen to faster music, and the other way around. So slower brain rhythms went along with slower preferred music. So that's an example how brain rhythms influence our perceptual rhythms. And then the other case should be the case as well, but no one has done it yet. So it should also be the case that people with faster brain rhythms, for example, in motor areas, move faster. That should be very obvious, but it hasn't been shown yet, so we're on it. And so now hopefully you can see that all of these things are connected, but you might ask yourself, why is this important? So for me, I just love doing this basic research, and I think it's super exciting, and I love studying these things. But some people need a bit more reason. So it has, for example, been shown, and it's quite established, that people who walk slowly are more at risk to develop dementia. So first of all, if you're a slow walker, don't worry at all. We can't say anything about the individual, and there are lots of other things that influence whether someone gets dementia or Alzheimer or not. So it's not a given thing, but on average, overall, there's a tendency for people who walk slow to have a higher risk to develop dementia. And so this is actually one of the things I want to study next. I'm not a dementia expert yet, but I could imagine that looking at dementia from this angle of different rhythms could help to make sense of things, because at the moment no one knows why this is the case, like slow walking and dementia, why these are connected. But if it's the case that a slow motor rhythm is associated with slower brain rhythms in certain areas, and this influences our perceptual rhythms, if all of this is connected, then this finding could make a bit more sense, so that cognitive skills could be influenced by these rhythms as well, because they have to do with perception. And another maybe important implication is that in motor rehabilitation or in music therapy, it could be that it's useful to use an individual's preferred rhythm, so either preferred motor rhythm or preferred perceptual rhythms like preferred music, to get better outcomes. So to either speed up motor rehabilitation or to improve the outcome of music therapy if an individual's preferred rhythms are used. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Gosh, how interesting. Great. If you would like to stop sharing, that's perfect. Excellent. So as I mentioned, we'll have all the talks in a row and then do questions. But obviously, if questions occur to anyone as we're going through, do feel free to pop them in the chat now so that you don't forget them, and we'll come back to them later. Okay, so our second speaker is Dr. Philip Murray, who's a senior lecturer in mathematics in the School of Science and Engineering. And in fact, I'm going to share his PowerPoint due to a technical glitch. So let me just do that now. And he's going to be looking at pattern formation in biological systems. So Philip, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thanks for the invite to come along today. So in the next slide, I'm going to show you, you can see some images with some very nice patterns. So on the left-hand side of the top, you can see a zebrafish with a striped body pattern. And then on the right, you can see a leopard. So there's a fundamental question in developmental biology, which is, how do these patterns get laid down? So where do they come from? And the answer is almost always they get laid down very early in development, whenever the embryo is very, very small, that the cells that later on are going to make pigment to make, for example, the white stripe or the blue bit that you can see in the zebrafish's coat, then these cells get instructed very early on to be a certain kind of cell. And then the embryo grows a lot, and then what you see in the pictures in the top are the kind of end point of that pattern formation process. But in the movie in the bottom, if we skip on to the next bit, then hopefully you'll be able to see some dynamics. And now you're looking at a Drosophila, which is a fruit fly. It's an organism used in developmental biology to study lots of different aspects of pattern formation, as well as many other things. But you can see the formation of some of these patterns. And here, each little region that you can see is a cell, and each white spot is a cell that's expressing a certain gene. And that gene isn't so important for today. But what's important is that whenever the little white cell becomes white, then it inhibits the neighbors around it from doing so. And this is a mechanism of pattern formation called lateral inhibition. And these little white dots, they end up going on to become bristles, so mechanosensory organs, hairs on a certain part of the Drosophila's body, which it then uses, later on for biological function. And then the picture on the right, it's an image which is a stripe pattern, but this is actually a temporal pattern. So on the x-axis is time. Not quite sure if you can see that. And on the y-axis, where you see red, that means a cell was making expressing a certain gene, a circadian clock gene, so a 24-hour rhythm. So at the beginning of the experiment, on the very left of the picture, the line looks kind of vertical, and that's telling you that all the cells were doing the same thing at the same time. They were all making a particular gene at the same time, and that's why you see red. But then as time evolves and as you move from left to right in this picture, you can see the vertical lines are becoming a lot more jumbled up. And again, this is an example of pattern formation. And from a mathematical point of view, this picture isn't so different from the zebrafish, right? It's a stripe pattern, but it's just a temporal pattern, which is what we've been hearing a little bit about, rather than a fixed spatial pattern. So if we move to the next slide, I guess the question might be, well, why should we care about this? And, I guess, we're studying, again, basic scientific processes. So how do those cells know to go to that place and make that particular pattern? And do we understand what the regulatory principles are? So that's a basic scientific question in its own right. But of course, once you understand these things, then you can apply that knowledge to translate it to understanding disease. And maybe that understanding of how the system works will help you understand what happens whenever that system doesn't work so well for various reasons, and perhaps why you can how one could develop treatments to treat a particular condition. So in the next slide, you might be wondering at this point, well, what's this got to do with mathematics? So we can obviously use mathematics to try and understand patterns that we see in nature. So I've just explained to you what the image is on the right, and then I've scribbled some white lines on top of it. So we can use mathematics to classify patterns that we see. So those horizontal white lines are me trying to make a readout of what the period is of this pattern, right? What time elapses until the next red, little red stripe region happens. And then we can also look at the synchrony of the pattern. So the vertical white lines are me just scribbling on top of the red lines. And I guess the point is that as you move from left to right and time evolves, that line is getting more jiggly, essentially. And of course, one can kind of formalize these ideas mathematically, and you could use mathematics to develop some kind of quantitative metric, some objective way to define how squiggly the line is, if you like. And then we can also use mathematics to simulate, patterns, so we can try and reason out how we think the system works and come up with a model. And then we can use mathematics and computing to try and simulate then, if we try and describe mathematically how the various pieces of the system operate, then can we reproduce that pattern in a with a computer code? And that can help us to try and understand what the governing principles are. Maybe the model we come up with first is wrong, and when we try and simulate it with mathematics, we realize it's missing a piece, and that couldn't possibly work. And we can use then modeling and simulation to kind of help develop our intuition and understanding about how systems work. So just to kind of give you a demonstration of that, and this isn't my research field, but on the next slide, then I found this nice movie of a heart beating. So it's an example of quite a complex system. And if we play the movie, you'll hopefully recognize some features of it. But this movie is generated from a computer simulation, and the colors at the minute are simulating the electrical waves that propagate through cardiac tissue, and ultimately they change the mechanical properties of the tissue and cause the cardiac cells to beat and the heart to change shape, and that's ultimately what causes the pumping motion. So we can kind of put together our mathematical descriptions of a system, quite complex systems, and then use that to try and simulate what we see in in reality. And then in principle, one could use those simulations to try and understand, features of the system that ultimately might perhaps be related to again, this translational aspect. And I guess the relevance of this picture today is that it's quite a complicated pattern, right? You've got this kind of mechanical changes, shape changes, and underlying that, you've got changes in chemical concentrations and electrical waves and lots of different variables coming together. So I hope that just provides an illustration of kind of real world important patterns that we might study and use kind of simulations to try and to get to grips with. So in the next slide, then I don't work on cardiac modeling, so modeling behavior of the heart, and I thought I would kind of introduce you just to a couple of things that I work on. So if we go to the next slide, you can again see this familiar picture. It's a different image, but on the top right, again, you're looking at cells during embryonic development, and you can see that they're doing this lateral inhibition pattern. So you can see that there are the little white ones, and then they're surrounded by cells that aren't white. So they are laterally inhibiting their neighbors from doing the same thing that they're doing. And we want to understand, what the governing principles are in this system. So you can see a schematic diagram then on the bottom, and it kind of represents this checkerboard pattern, right? Where you can see the white cells at the end point surrounded by black cells. And this is just again classifying the pattern that we see in the cells in the image above. So if we go to the next slide then, so I've recently been working on kind of modeling these types of pattern formation processes. And I'm not going to go into really any of the details today, but the key idea is that there's a kind of network, and you try and capture in your model, what you think the most important things are that's happening in a cell. And that's the schematic diagram in front of you today. And I don't have time to explain what all the arrows do, but it's somehow describing what you think one of those little units are in that lateral inhibition picture that I showed you. And then on the next slide, we can see that we're interested then in what happens if you let the cells talk to one another in your simulation or in your model. So now I had one of these little networks, and now the arrows represent kind of mathematically describing interactions between two cells. And then the final slide, I'm going to show you some kind of movies of pattern formation in this problem. So you're looking at a square, but I'm simulating the pattern with different values of a model parameter. So I'm trying to explore how changing a certain parameter will affect pattern formation in the problem. So the question is, well, how do the patterns emerge, and how does the pattern that forms depend on a parameter in this model that we're studying? So if Matthew plays the movie, then you'll see that we see in this model, again, I'm glossing over lots of the details, but you see this kind of pattern formation happens. And I guess the take home is that in the bottom right figure, then you can see a nice checkerboard, and this is a bit like these lateral inhibition patterns that I showed you. But then in the figure on the right, you can see a checkerboard, but it's got this interesting kind of wave rolling around, and it's kind of like a checkerboard that flips its state periodically in time. And I'm not sure there's any biological significance to that, but I think it looks very nice. But the kind of idea here is that we're studying pattern formation, and we can see this checkerboard pattern, and this resembles what we see when we look at some pattern formation events in the developing embryo. But there's also some more interesting things happening, and maybe we can use our model to predict patterns that one might see in an experiment. And then our experimental colleagues, may find those patterns or may not, but this might help to interpret data at a later date. And on the final slide I'm going to show you, then it's another example of pattern formation. So if we again run this movie, then I've just changed one little thing, and now you can see these what are called target patterns happen. So you can kind of see there's a central region, and it oscillates, and then you see this kind of pattern of oscillating waves. It's quite psychedelic in the bottom right picture, and this would just go on forever, the bottom right one. So it's a periodic pattern in time and space. And so these are some examples of the kind of patterns that we get out of this model that I've just described. So in the final slide for me, I guess I just wanted to highlight that we can study mathematical features of patterns that we see in the real world, and then we can use mathematics to try and classify the patterns and simulate pattern formation. And hopefully this can help us understand the governing principles in the system we're looking at. So thanks for everyone for listening, and thank you, Matthew, for doing a supreme job with the slide changes. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Gosh, that's really interesting. I think particularly, obviously, because of the links with Darcy Thompson and his own sort of early interest in pattern formation, it's great to see just how much more complex that whole story is now. Brilliant. Okay, well, coming on to our third speaker now. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Dominic Smith, who's a senior lecturer in philosophy in the School of Humanities, Social Sciences and Law. And he's going to be looking at the role of philosophy in helping to pattern data. And I believe Wikipedia will be involved. So Dominic, hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Thanks to you and Alex for this invite. Thanks to Anne, Philip and Aurora. It's great to meet you all and to hear your talks. And thanks to everyone for being here and listening. I'd like to start with some interactive pattern play. So this was to be conducted with smartphones in the gallery. It might be more impactful and more ergonomic actually in this format. So what I'd invite you to do is open a new window in your internet browser and to go to Wikipedia. So to exemplify this, I'll briefly screen share. If you can't reach your browser, don't worry, I'll guide you through what I have in mind. So I'll screen share Wikipedia and show you. Let's see. Can you all see that okay? Okay.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Okay, so looking at this page, I'd like you to go to a Wikipedia page of your choice. You can start anywhere you like. So being topical, I thought I might start at this page. And what I'd like you to do is hit the first main hyperlink in the text. So if you've got storm, the first link would be natural environment. And what I'd like you to do is repeat this process. And if you can, there's no obligation to do this, count how many times you're repeating it. And when you get to the page for philosophy, I'd like you to type "got it" into the chat. So I'll just show you, and perhaps you can beat me to it with this. So we started at storm. We're moving through the pages. And we get to philosophy. So perhaps you can do this as well, and it'd be interesting to see if anyone ends up anywhere other than philosophy in the chat. So what we just played is the so-called getting to philosophy game. And I'll just stop sharing so I can go back to full screen of you all. We've just played the getting to philosophy game. That's what this is known as. So this game is based on the fact that in around 97% of cases, Wikipedia pages eventually link to philosophy. So this high an incidence of links is unique to philosophy, and it was spotted by Wikipedia user Mark J in May 2008. It features at the start of the BBC documentary The Joy of Data by University College London mathematician Hannah Fry. And so it's great that I'm going after the talk on mathematics, so that's quite elegant. Thank you for that, Matthew. So this program was released in 2016 and has held a consistently high rating on Internet Movie Database ever since, with the full documentary and assorted clips streaming on platforms including iPlayer, Amazon Prime, and YouTube. So here's how Fry, having started the program with the admission that she hasn't always loved data, describes the game that we've just played. So this is a direct quote from Hannah Fry. Mark noticed that if you hit the first link in the main text of any Wikipedia page and then do the same for the next page, a pattern emerges. So from the page for data, for example, we get a link to set, to maths, to quantity, to property, and then philosophy, which after a few more links will loop back onto itself. Now the page egg ends up in the same place, and even that famously philosophical boy band One Direction will take you all the way through to philosophy, although you have to go through science to get there. So that's the description. Here's the explanation. So this is Fry explaining what's at work here. Now that's pretty cool, But how did it change my mind about data? Well, the pattern that Mark J. discovered and the data that was captured and analysed, it revealed a hidden mathematical structure, because Wikipedia is just a network with loops and chains hidden all over the place, and it is something that can be described beautifully using mathematics. For me, this was the perfect example of how there are two parallel universes. There's the tangible, noisy, and messy one, the one that you can touch, see, and experience, but there's also the mathematical one where I think the key to our understanding lies. And then, lovely phrase, she says, data is the bridge between those two universes. So what this final shift charts is a move from an endorsement of mathematical description to a series of properly philosophical moments. So we get a speculative transformation of the story of getting to philosophy, so from a personal anecdote about how Fry has not always loved data, into a story of how we make sense of our contemporary world. We get a reflection on the sense data of experience, so the tangible, noisy, and messy. We get an assertion on the privileged status of mathematics for knowledge, as where the key to our understanding lies. And lastly, we get a properly metaphysical statement about the fundamental nature of reality. So data is the bridge between these two universes. Switching scene. Shortly after Fry's opening scene in this documentary, The Joy of Data features an interview with Luciano Floridi, who's professor of philosophy at Yale University. He states, when you face extraordinary challenges, the worst thing you can do is get close to them. You need to take a long run up. The bigger the gap, the longer the run up, and the run up is called philosophy. So this is Floridi's answer to the question, why philosophy? As he puts it immediately before the moment I've just cited. So to quote Floridi, we all agree that we are undergoing a major revolution in human history. The digital world replacing the analog world, a world based on data, a world made of code rather than biological and physical data. That is extraordinary. Why philosophy at this stage? So Floridi's description of philosophy as a long run-up features as an answer to his own question. Philosophers are very good at asking rhetorical questions, but it could also be read as an answer to the enigma of the getting to philosophy pattern that's described by Fry. So on one level, that philosophy is the end point for so many pages on Wikipedia is something that we can explain quite banally is an issue in computer engineering. So it just has to do with how abstraction works, moving up classification chains. But on another level, it's virtually irresistible, at least for me, not to consider. Floridi's answer seems to provide a profound answer to the question of why it is philosophy in particular that features as this kind of endpoint. I would suggest because it seems we're undergoing a major revolution in human history that is extraordinary, and because philosophy might be the kind of discipline that is well adapted to help us address such things. So just one further concluding set of reflections. The Joy of Data is a wonderfully wide-ranging program that interviews philosophers, mathematicians, historians, data scientists, and scores of other professionals to assess the impact of innovations in data collection and patterning. It's well worth a watch, is the take-home message. All this said, the situation of pattern play in our world today is such that it would be remiss not to comment on a more vexing feature of the programme that emerges when it's considered not as a narrative, a story, or exercise in science communication, but as itself a data set capable of being patterned in certain ways. So to exemplify what I mean, consider that Fry and Floridi's interviews, as described above, are parts of this overall data set called the Joy of Data. Now consider that many viewers will encounter these not as parts of this whole, but as their own separate data sets without a bridge between or without a container. Fry's interview, for instance, streams on both BBC iPlayer and YouTube as a 3-minute clip called Marmalade, Socks and One Direction, and Floridi's interview is signposted on his personal YouTube channel. So in many cases, these discrete data sets will act as high-quality clickbait for luring viewers to the full program. In many other cases, however, they just lead to a lot of gaps. If Fry's interview is watched without Floridi's answer to the question why philosophy, for instance, then philosophy emerges from her clip as an entirely mysterious term. If Floridi's interview is watched without Fry's opening discussion, then a valuable sense of context and example is lost. So the point here is a formal point. It's that our world is a world in which data sets are highly divisible, and they're coded to stream incessantly on platforms that come and go across unstable temporalities. So even a program as sophisticated as the joy of data exemplifies this, and it's forced to play by those rules for its views. How many clicks, how many likes? So how then are we to make sense of this? Perhaps, after the fashion of the Wikipedia page for philosophy itself, we might look back on ourselves to the start of this talk. So just a few more reflections, then I'll shut up. So suppose we consider Wikipedia not just as Mark J. or Hannah Fry do, so that is as a data set or network in which elegant patterns are to be discerned, but also from a user interface or user experience perspective. So how and why does a Wikipedia user typically look up a page? On the how, quantitative data indicates a clear answer through big brand search engines and increasingly on smartphones. On the why, the answer we might hazard is this: because they want to get close to the details of something. So whether One Direction, socks or marmalade, or one of the places that you started from at the beginning of this talk. So this desire to pattern data as details is, I want to suggest, a deeply philosophical endeavor. And what it shows in the context of this talk, I think, is quite specific in that we need to find ways of bridging the gaps between Fry and Floridi's respective recommendations that remain attentive to the kind of Wikipedia user just envisaged, which is the Wikipedia user we all are when we use Wikipedia, except in a game as part of a philosophical thought experiment. So against Fry, we're not just in a situation of bridging a metaphysical gap between two separate universes, and against Floridi, it may not be all that desirable to try to avoid the details of that which is really close to us. Instead, we're in the kind of shared universe, I'd like to suggest, where all sorts of gaps appear to be opening up everywhere, whether they're gaps in knowledge, gaps in politics, gaps between generations, ecological and environmental gaps, economic gaps. So everyday experiences as banal as watching one YouTube video instead of another are capable of confirming this, that there are gaps everywhere. The question to be addressed then is this: what kind of enterprise will allow us to abstract from and get very close to the details at one and the same time? And so what we're after here is not just the bridge between universes or a long run up. And what we're after, I would suggest, is philosophy conceived as a situated and ongoing creative process of patterning and making sense, capable of bridging all sorts of gaps. So we could call this type of patterning philosophy for the 21st century. What a kind of pompous title like that should not lose sight of, however, is the fact that this is just exactly what Wikipedia users do when they play with patterns and search. And with that, I'll shut up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gosh, that was really, really fascinating and great to see all the different responses from the audience there. It's fantastic to see what everyone did and how short some of them are and how longer others are. Brilliant. Okay, well, coming on to our final speaker for tonight now, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Aurora Sicilia-Aguilar, who's a reader in physics in the School of Science and Engineering. And she's going to be particularly talking about her own specialist discipline of astrophysics and the importance of finding patterns. So, Aurora, I'll hand over to you.
Hi. So, can you see my screen and hear me fine?
Yep, looks good.
So, I'm coming from the side of physics. So then I'm going to be talking a bit about how patterns and finding patterns and structures is actually important in physics to understand the universe. And I'm going to go a bit from the side of physics itself, but also from the side of astrophysics, which is what I do. I work studying the formation of stars and planets, looking at images like the one that you can see here in the screen. So patterns and finding patterns is a very important thing in physics, because at the end, this is what actually helps us to understand how the universe works, which is what we try to do in physics. So we do experiments, we find things follow another, and then we can develop a pattern, and then we can develop a theory that will explain this. In astrophysics, we do similar things. The only difference with physics is that we cannot really do an experiment in the lab as we do in physics, because we can look, but we cannot touch. So then the patterns that we need to look for, the structure that we need to search, have to be done with what we have, which is essentially the light that comes from the stars, and then also the time that we can spend taking measurements and trying to connect them together. So now, how do we make sense of patterns? One of the issues that we face here in physics is that actually humans are very good at finding patterns or connecting the dots. You know, like if you look at the night sky, people from ancient times were seeing their birds and horses and music instruments and all that sort of things. But actually, what we know is that these stars are not really connected. Even if they look to us like they are all related and form a structure, if we look, for instance, at the distances of the stars, which are exemplified here by the parallax, looking at the same region of the sky tells us that stars seem to be close together and somehow forming the same pattern that are actually very far from each other. So we really need to, in physics, to make sure that we understand which are the dots that we need to join when we try to create our picture of the universe. The other very interesting thing about physics and patterns is that we actually find the patterns all over the place. If we go back to this image of a region that is forming stars, sometimes when I show it to people, they say, oh, you know, this looks like a cloud. This is actually called a molecular cloud because it looks like a cloud. Some people say, yeah, and what you see here, it looks like streams in water, or here like a shape in sand. And we keep patterns in water, in other fluids, in sand. We see them in the sky. Clouds look similar. Even if we just go and take the spectrum of a star that may look like this, and we look at these lines, we find some patterns that tell us about the structure inside atoms. And then if we look at the patterns of the atomic orbitals, we find that there are actually the same sort of patterns that we see, for instance, when we play a singing bowl, right? So we have things such as the equation that describes waves in physics that appears all over the place, and it can explain things such as the vibrations of the sun, or actually a music instrument. And many of the tools that we can use to analyze, to find the periodicity of these patterns, vibration, harmonics, they appear everywhere, which is amazing. So coming a bit back to my work, because I study star formation, one of the main regions I look at is star clusters. So this is one of the ones I'm more fond of. I have been looking at it for many years. So this is a star cluster that is in here, and there are new stars forming in there. So this cloud is just collapsing under its own gravity and forming new objects. But if you try to look at individual objects and see what happens, you have the problem, the same that with constellations. You don't know which objects are related. And then we have tools that look for patterns, such as the Gaia Space Telescope. You can see a bit of an image from the European Space Agency here of what the Gaia Space Telescope looks. It's actually a telescope that looks mostly at time. And what I also wanted to show, because a pattern I think is wonderful, is how Gaia is mapping the sky, just rotating and creating all this nice pattern that you see here in the corner, while it measures the positions and the velocities of the stars. So once that it measures the positions and the velocities of the stars, and we can see what is connected. So if we look in this cluster, we see some regions that are moving together, like the blue objects here. They are actually an expanding cluster. All these things that we see in the rim is moving in the same direction. If we look at smaller structures, objects that in principle look like they were maybe just aligned by chance. They are all converging together. So we can actually connect all these objects and see which ones belong together using distance and movement. So actually looking at these kind of patterns. Then this is not the only kind of pattern that we look at. So it was very good that Anne was talking about patterns in time, because one of the first things that people found when they started observing was that actually the heavens were not immutable as people had thought in the antiquity. There is actually variability and movement all over the place. You can see a lot of variability, for instance, in these two images of a star that I work on. It's a young star. Sometimes it looks bright and blue, sometimes it looks faint and red. because it's actually things are falling onto the star. When they fall, it shines brighter and it gets also hotter and bluer. So we can actually create this kind of plot where we look at how bright an object is versus time, and we can analyze it. And what is also amazing is that we have a huge amount of data. So I'm going now to start with a movie. And you are going to see some dates in here. Well, it looks like a very old movie because it's very old. When you see 16, 17, 19, it's not 2016 or 17. It's actually 1900s. So we have a lot of data from very old times. And in this case, we have a star that is variable. And we have these kind of shades that appear propagating over there. This is actually because this is a star that is surrounded by a disk forming planets. And this disk is coming by rotating around the star and producing shadows, the same that when you put your hands in front of a source of light. So we can actually see what is happening in that tiny space because it's all projected into the cloud. And we could continue looking at this until now, 100 years. So this also brings us a bit to the issue of trying to measure that sort of things, because here we have a problem of scale. So what you see here is an artist's impression of a star that is forming planets. And well, it's an artist's impression because there is no way you would see these structures even with the more powerful telescopes. So just to give you an idea, if you imagine that this star surrounded by a disk, what the size is, well, the disk is going to have a size of a few times the size of the solar system. If we wanted to look at it at a telescope, it would be, for instance, like looking at a butterfly, only that we are in Dundee and the butterfly is in Fife, right? If we wanted to look at how a planet like Earth is forming in there, it will be like looking at the eyes of the butterfly. And if we wanted to see how the star forms, which is some of the things that I do in star formation, we will need to look at the tiny islets of this butterfly that is actually flying in Fife, and we are in Dundee, right? So this is impossible to resolve even with the most powerful telescope. But the lucky thing is that small structures are hard to see, right? Because we are limited by diffraction of our optics, by the instrumentation. But because they are small, they change. Stars rotate in a few days, the Earth rotates in a year. These are all human time scales. So we can actually use time to map space. And this is one of the things I do for my work. I'm running different observational projects. One of them is called Star Melt. The other one is called North Phase. I look at this kind of data, how stars are changing. I try to connect how they are changing in time, make their light curves. Then I can also measure the velocities with spectra, because things that are moving to us, they get shifted to the blue. Things that are moving away, they get shifted to the red. And then I can study the pattern in the same way that I could study the harmonics and the patterns of a music instrument, or of the climate how the weather is changing. So in the same way, and then by looking at this, I can actually reconstruct the structure of these objects at a few stellar radii, which will be like, looking at the tiny islets of the butterfly that is flying in Fife from Dundee. And that's not the only thing I wanted to highlight. So coming a bit back to the kind of general physics picture, symmetry is also something that we find a lot in physics, and it's a very, very key role. So what you can see here in this image is a simulation of the structure of the universe. It's called the Millennium Simulation. And what you can see is that although the universe locally looks very non-symmetric, we have stars, we have planets, if you look at the big structure, it looks very symmetric. So, and this is one of the properties of our universe, but it's also one of the properties that we keep finding in our equations. And it's one of the most amazing things that we find in physics, all this kind of symmetry that we also see in the equations. So this was something that was actually noticed by a lady, Emmy Noether. And then she actually realized that all the symmetries that we find in our universe and in our equations are behind some of the deepest principles that we can imagine. So even the students in high school, they apply conservation of energy to calculate things, or conservation of momentum. Why does it get conserved? It's actually because the universe has these patterns, has this symmetry. So the universe is symmetric in time. We do an experiment now, we do it in 1,000 years. And then we find the same thing. This actually leads to energy conservation. We do it here, we do it in Fife, we do it in Dundee, we do it in Andromeda Galaxy. We find the same. This leads to momentum conservation, which is a really deep part of physics. And just coming to the end, I'm going back to my message that actually in physics, just finding these patterns is what helps us to make sense of things when we do an experiment, we are just looking for the patterns and the trends, and then we can actually see what is happening, why it's happening, connect the dots. And then when we are writing our theory based on what we have observed, even the own structure of our equations and our theory can allow us to make further predictions and actually to move looking for new results. And then also coming back to why patterns are beautiful, why we actually find them pleasant. I think actually in physics, what we are doing is creating the means to understand the universe, to be able to view the universe from our own eyes and see how everything is connected. And this is also a wonderful and beautiful thing that we can find meaning in these patterns. So just to finish up with a citation that I like this citation by Oscar Wilde: "The artist is the creator of beautiful things." So sometimes we think about physics in a very mechanistic way, but I like thinking of it on the more beautiful way, which is finding the structure, looking at the structure, finding what is the connection between all of these, and actually even the fact that we can do this and we can understand things is one of the most amazing and beautiful things of the universe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Gosh, what a lovely place to end as well. That's really nice. Right, well, we have time for questions. So folks, if anyone does have questions, do please pop them in the chat, or indeed, because there's not actually that many of us here, feel free to unmute yourself and shout things out. I guess I'll maybe start by actually maybe going back to our first speaker, Anne, actually. It was really interesting to hear about these links between the motor rhythms and the perceptual rhythms and so on, and the way that you'd obviously used various experiments to show that. But I wondered maybe you could say a little bit more about the actual experiments that were done in order to create that data in the first place.
Yes, I'm still very flashed by physics, but I try to go back to my own field now. So for example, in our lab and also many other people, we usually we have behavioral tasks and paradigms that we use, and we have when we do an in-person experiment, we also can measure people's brain rhythms. So these are the two components that I often do. For example, in my lab, during COVID, for many years, I did a lot of online experiments. So this would only give us the behavioral side of things, but it allowed me to try out lots of different things and quite fast. And so to look at brain rhythms, we usually use EEG, so the electroencephalogram, where people have a cap on and with electrodes, and that can measure the tiny electrical fluctuations that come from our brain cells. And then for motor rhythms, we are a bit lazy in the lab, I have to say, because we usually use finger tapping because it's just so easy to assess. But we know that finger tapping has to do with walking, talking, and so on. So some other labs have actually looked at all this and asked people to walk in a way that is comfortable for them. They recorded them walking and analyzed the walking rhythm, and then the tapping that everyone uses, and clapping, cycling. So other people have done all this, have done this big work for us to show that these are all related. And then for perceptual rhythms, there are lots of different ways you can look at that. Very often the preference is just one way to just present people with. It could be anything. It can be music, it can be speech, it can be films, like everything that you can make rhythmic, and then just asking them, giving them two different ones and asking them which one they prefer, or let them use a slider, how much they like specific rhythm. So there's different ways to do that. Or the other side of things is to actually test when are people good. What is an optimal rhythm for people to discriminate things in their environment, to hear different, to perceive different things. Yeah, I think that's all the three, like the paradigms you can use for all three things.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting. I see a couple of hands have gone up. Dominic, do you want to come in first?
I just wondered, Anne, when you gave your talk, I was really interested in the finger tapping, and I wondered if I'm completely wrong, please correct me. I just wondered if it had anything to do with leveling the distinction between musicians and non-musicians. So it's like a very basic form of music or musicality. Was that part of the study design?
So we usually ask our participants about their musical skills because we know that musicians are quite different. So learning an instrument has vast effects on everything, on our perception, on our motor skills, on everything, cognitive skills. So it's always a good thing to ask. When it comes to the finger tapping, I think musicians who definitely musicians who have to play where rhythmicity is important, like drummers, for example, but many other musicians as well. They are more more exact, so they're less variable between their finger taps. But I think in this case it's just a tiny difference because we all can do this quite well because it's such a natural thing to move rhythmically. This is completely normal. So yeah, musicians, when you ask them, they can definitely do it better. They probably do it better naturally as well. But we all can move rhythmically really well. And concerning the tempo or the preferences, that can be, that's the same. That can be, it's not influenced by whether someone plays an instrument or not. It is, for example, influenced by age. So the rhythms, they basically start out super fast in childhood, then they become slower when we get older, and everything slows down. But musicianship doesn't influence the things we like to hear or the way we like to move. It would just influence how well we can tap synchronously, how well we can synchronize with other things, for example.
Thanks. Thank you.
Aurora, you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, so I had a question also for Anne, because you mentioned just the speed at which people talk has also its own rhythm and its own pattern. And I was just wondering, what about the language? Because I have heard that different languages have actually different speeds. And once I read that languages that can put a lot of information in a small kind of, in a brief sound, they tend to be slower than languages that need long words with many syllables to transmit the same information. So have you looked into that?
Not me personally, but people in the field have done that. And yeah, for example, Italian is a prime example for people speaking fast. So the speaking rhythm is faster for Italians than for, I don't know, probably you can say Germans. But there are studies that look at the actual information content for every unit, and that does not change. So whether it's a fast language or a slow language, or a language with long words or shorter words, or differently organized like tonal languages, the information, the pace of the information units is basically the same across all languages.
That's really interesting. So I had a question which is, I guess, for everybody, in that obviously what we've tried to do here is bring together people from different disciplines, and it's really interesting to hear all these different approaches. But I guess that many of you are already collaborating with different disciplines, and I guess very obviously, Philip, obviously you work a lot with biologists, and I'm sure there are other examples here. But so I guess it'd be interesting to hear from you all, I guess, about how important it is to bring together those disciplines and think about things, or get other people's points of view on your own research. Who would like to go first on that one?
Yeah, I guess I can say something. Yeah, so it is very important, and I guess there's always a barrier because within disciplines, then people a language develops around a particular problem based upon previous work. So if you're getting into a new discipline, then you have to overcome that barrier of figuring out what they're on about. But then I think once one does that, then someone coming from the outside can often have valuable insights because they're bringing a fresh perspective or fresh tools to a problem, and that can be valuable.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else?
I wanted to also make the point that there is, when you look at these patterns that we observe in physics, there is also quite a lot of communication with other disciplines that have also been looking at patterns. Like, for instance, if you look for all this time variability, how to analyze time patterns, these are things that have been made in other disciplines, maybe people who are using this for studying weather patterns, or even things that are very much related to music. And then also the tools that you create in astrophysics, for instance, for analyzing an image. These are things that can be also applied to other subjects where people also look structures in image, like some of the software that has been developed for astrophysics is also being used to find structures in, for instance, tissues to try to identify cancer there. So there are a lot of things that are connected.
Could I just say as well, Matthew, I think something that's really interesting in this connection is just having sites and opportunities and events for this type of sharing, because we get siloed otherwise. And something I found very interesting was the through line of aesthetics between all of the talks. Philip's remark about psychedelic aspect of the images, and then the closing quote that you used, Aurora, and obviously in some ways the entire content and of your talk. And what struck me is, if we were doing this in the context you'd envisaged, would be moving from an art gallery into a discussion space, and that seems particularly well designed as a site for enabling this kind of reflection. So yeah, that's a reflection on the form rather than content, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you for that. And it is always one of the things that we're really keen to do with the museum collections, is try and use those as a sort of starting point to bring together different people and ideas and so on. So I'm conscious of time, so we should probably bring things to a close. But just to say another big thank you to all of our amazing speakers. I hope you all feel as I do. It's been a really, really fascinating and stimulating evening. So apologies that we can't actually be together in person, but thank you so much for joining us online. And hope you all stay safe until the weather improves. And thanks very much for coming. So good night, everybody.